At first it might seem strange that the most populous Muslim country in the world would be located far away from the Middle East, far away from North Africa, far from South Asia, in Southeast Asia, on an archipelago of islands called Indonesia. This is the most populous Muslim country on earth. Now, how would something like that happen? Well, it makes a little more sense when you begin to see Indonesia in its historic role as a great maritime hub, often the site of a great maritime empire connecting the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea. Dominating those seas for hundreds and hundreds of years were Muslim traders, Muslim merchants. We know that the third caliph sent Muslim emissaries to China, and they would have gone right through this archipelago. Meanwhile, the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea would have been largely dominated by Muslim merchants. And this is the great hub connecting the two. So maybe it makes some sense when you consider that aspect. These Muslim merchants would spread their ideas, the ideas of Islam. They would convert locals, or they would settle down locally, marry local women, raise their children up in the faith of Muhammad. And before long, you have these little Muslim enclaves all over East Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, including in this archipelago, including in Indonesia. We know that in the 900s, Muslim merchants of Arab descent were very active in these waters, looking for and trading for spices, the great product, spices, the world-changing product. Marco Polo, returning home from China in the 1290s, reported on an entire Muslim town on the island of Sumatra, the big island. We know that by the late 1200s, probably the first Muslim sultanate had been established in what would be called Indonesia, on the island of Sumatra, northwest Sumatra. It was called Samudera Pasai, the first Muslim state in what would be called Indonesia. But in order to become the most dominant faith system in Indonesia, or in what would become Indonesia, Islam had to go up against some very well-established religious traditions. I mean, there was Hinduism going back many, many centuries, Buddhism, many, many centuries, plus the local animism, or a fusion of two or three of those. But in any case, established tradition, established royal patronage, established institutions, infrastructure, all that is already here connected to these other faith systems. So how's Islam going to replace that without, conquering foreign armies? We often think of Islam as spreading via, conquering zealots. And in many places, that was the case. But in Indonesia, the most populous Muslim country on earth, that was not the case at all. There were no conquering foreign Muslim armies. So how did Islam spread here? And we mentioned the merchant factor, but there are at least three other historical factors that are worth considering in order to understand this phenomenon. One factor, Sufism, or more specifically, Sufi missionary work, the efforts of Sufi saints. See, if you ask an Indonesian today how Indonesia became converted to Islam for the most part, they may tell you that it was the work of Sufi saints. In fact, some believe that it was Sufi missionaries who were here first. Not Muslim traders, but the first Muslims were Sufi missionaries. Whatever the truth, Sufism represents a more, well, at least generally speaking, there are many kinds of Sufism, but generally speaking, it's a more mystical form of Islam. It represents a more syncretistic form of the faith, much more adaptable, much more willing to use local art, local cooking, local dance, local custom in general, and use those things as tools to preach the faith and incorporate elements of them into faith and practice. So Sufism came over very well in Indonesia, seems to have worked very well and had great success here. We know that by the 1400s, some Sufis had organized enough to have a Council of Nine. Now, we don't know much about the Council of Nine. There are a lot who think they know a lot about it, but the historical details are actually quite murky. But in any case, this Council of Nine was formed to coordinate efforts. Some of the founding members had ties, kinship ties, to the elite of Majapahit, which gave them great position within the Majapahit state, which will be important for later. When Majapahit falls, these guys are going to be around to fill that vacuum. A second factor, the rise of Malacca, and specifically the rise of Malacca as a Muslim sultanate. See, Malacca had been founded in the 1400s, but somewhere along the way, and certainly by the mid-1400s, the rulers of Malacca had become sultans. They'd adopted that title, and they'd become Muslim. They'd converted to Islam, which plugged them into the global Muslim trade network and helped Malacca gained a position as probably the most dominant port in Southeast Asia. It began to erect the beginnings of a maritime empire. It also became the center of Muslim learning, and that learning spread out from Malacca through the Malay Peninsula, all across the Indonesian archipelago, all the way to the southern Philippines and beyond. Malacca also cultivated strong connections. In fact, it imported much of its food from North Java, those Muslim communities in North Java, which would be very important in just a second. One by one, Malacca began to take over the various trade routes in the region, which brings us to our third factor, the fall of the great maritime empire and Hindu empire of Majapahit. Unfortunately for Majapahit, its decline coincided pretty perfectly with the rise of Malacca, and its decline included a civil war, so that'll tear up any state. Meanwhile, you got what used to be the northern coast of Java used to be part of Majapahit, but you've got those states up there, which include strong Muslim communities now, flexing their muscles of independence, cultivating more and more their ties with Malacca, and sort of following a local tradition, not uncommon around the world, between competitor states. In order to set yourself apart from your competitor state, the royal court adopts a different religion. So it used to be that in this region, if your competitor state was Hindu, you would adopt Buddhism, or vice versa. Well, now Islam's a viable option, especially with the rise of Malacca and other Muslim sultanates. Islam is a very viable option. It's got history now, it's got influence, and so you've got these northern Javan sultanates appearing. The first one, Demak, is the first Muslim sultanate on Java, will ultimately be the one to take down what's left of Majapahit, take down a few other Hindu-Buddhist kingdoms on Java, and take over most of the island. Meanwhile, you have those Sufi saints who, previously had high office in what had been Majapahit. Now they're very well positioned to fill the void in Java. Thus, on a foundation built by Muslim traders and merchants, at least three things came together: Sufi missionary efforts, the rise of Malacca, and the fall of the great empire of Majapahit to a Javanese sultanate. These things came together to create the conditions for a future Muslim Indonesia. And by 1600, Java was majority Muslim. Java, the island with the most people on it. To this day, the most populous of Indonesia's islands. Sumatra as well, majority Muslim by 1600. Now today there are 25 million Christians in Indonesia. There's at least 4 million, maybe 11 million Hindus in Indonesia, but there are over 200 million Muslims in Indonesia. That's 3 times as many Muslims as in Iran. That's 8 times as many as in Saudi Arabia. That's more than in all of North Africa combined.